The genre of the American Western has been adapted in all parts of the world through movies, books, and TV shows. But the stories of the Wild West have rarely focused on one group that was essential in exploring and building out these new frontiers: Chinese immigrants. I speak to Tom Lin, an author who's bringing a fresh perspective to this traditional narrative.
Tom was born in Beijing and moved to New York City when he was 4 years old. His debut novel is The Thousand Crimes of Ming, a Western about a Chinese-American outlaw.
I wanted to put an Asian American in the West. I didn't watch or read a lot of Westerns, but I loved the landscape so much. And so I wanted to write this Western to pay tribute to the landscape, and I wanted to put someone in it that I could relate to, that I hadn't seen very often in other works. And so, it does come out of this really basic desire to see yourself represented, and then I think I found it becoming something more. I get emails from readers sometimes, and the ones that I love the most are like, this is the first book that I've read where the main character is someone that I could see myself being, and
that's important.
That's huge. That's the best kind of feedback that a writer can get. That you've achieved this kind of telepathy through the medium of the book, that you've gotten into someone's head and shown them that things could be otherwise.
Tom's book is set in the mid-19th century. At that time, news of the California gold rush prompted large-scale Chinese immigration. When they failed to strike it rich in gold, many Chinese immigrants turned to other jobs, including building the transcontinental railroad. The work was strenuous and dangerous, and hostility towards Chinese workers made living in the United States even more risky.
Talk to me about what drove you to write this book. One of the other things that I really like about this book is it does tell kind of this kind of horrific history that a lot of people in the United States may have read in history books, maybe a sentence or two. And one of the passages, these guys are just working on the railroad tracks, and it's backbreaking work, and they're getting $5, and the guy comes by and says, "Next week we're going to give them $3." That one little passage is just kind of an indicator of the type of abuse and degradation that these folks live through. Can you talk about that and the importance of putting that in this book?
Yeah, so historically we have very few, almost none, and it's very rare for any kind of historical record to be so sparse, especially after industrialization. But we have almost no records of first-hand experiences of working the railroad as a Chinese laborer. And it wasn't because, presumably they did write things down, they did keep journals, but it was just simply never deemed important enough to preserve in the archive. What we keep for posterity is always a political action of what we think the future is going to want to know more about. And at the time, it was simply unimportant to keep track of these experiences. And so a lot of the work that we have to do in modern times, especially with these Chinese laborers, is archaeological in nature. We have to reconstruct, we have to figure out for ourselves, we have to infer what it would have been like. And there's ways of going about that. So one of the things that I did was I went up to Donner Summit in the wintertime. You're in these tunnels that the laborers dug themselves. And the longest one goes on for 550 yards. It's 5 whole football fields through the center of a mountain, solid granite. And they dug these with hand tools. And we have the tools, we know the process, and you can kind of get all these pieces for yourself, and you can begin to reconstruct what it must have been like. And the answer is it must have been horrible. There's an exhibit at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento that is a block of granite in this kind of chicken wire cage, and it has all the tools there, and visitors are invited to go and take a swing at it. And I think that exhibit's been there for at least a decade, and they've made it, I think, 3/4 of an inch into the block. I mean, it's remarkable work. And so even if we don't have any of their experiences or any of their stories, you can still go to these tunnels, and what they've done remains in spite of everything, in spite of forgetting their names and their experiences. Their labor has changed the way that this country developed. And I think that for me was a very profound moment of, this is something that we should pay more attention to.
And channeling that pain and agony of that life as you're writing that, can you talk about that experience for you and the importance of getting it right?
I wanted the story to be as factually grounded as possible so that when we begin to see the supernatural, when we begin to see the remarkable, that it feels like that it could be as grounded as historical fact. You establish a pact with the reader that I'm going to be absolutely accurate with you about gun mechanics and about how long you can travel on a horse. And with all these things in mind, when I'm going to show you magic, and when I do, I want you to believe that as much as you believe all this other stuff. But on the other hand, the research, I think, was a way for me to avoid writing because I found it so brutal. And because I think one of the hardest things for fiction for me is you have to stake out a narrative across this field of infinity. You can pick any story, anything can happen. And when you're greeted with that much choice, you end up being paralyzed, at least in my experience. And so what historical research did for me is it established guardrails or kind of goalposts that I could thread through. And to have them kind of there and coloring the story, impacting the way that people spoke and behaved, but not the main point of the story. I think it lends it a more realistic character because, when we're talking just in our daily lives, we don't mention the news. We don't mention what's happening all the time, but it does affect us and it mediates our experience. And to kind of reproduce that same feeling in the book, I think required that kind of depth of research and commitment to accuracy.
The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su earned Tom the 2022 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. At 25, at the time, he was the youngest ever recipient.
One of the things I always resist whenever I interview an author is giving away enough of the book that they want to lunge across and strangle me. So I'd rather have you kind of describe the book than me, because people are probably like, okay, tell me about the book. What's the book about?
Yeah, I'll give you the elevator pitch then, which is a Chinese-American assassin, starts in Salt Lake City and is out for revenge to rescue his abducted wife from Sacramento. From the men who kidnapped her and forced him into labor on the railroad. Along the way, he meets a traveling circus show with real magical performers that he has to protect and he grows to love.
Everyone kind of uses the shoehorn genre that this is a Western, but I see it as much more than that. I mean, there's philosophy in there. I mean, it's really, can you talk about constructing this? Because I don't think that that's fair to call it that it lands in that genre, and I don't know how you feel about it.
Well, it's funny because the category of the genre is this kind of commercial. It's so that people can find what they're looking for, and so I've seen my book in the Western section of books. I've seen it in the historical fiction section, and I've also seen it in literary fiction, and I've even seen it quite close to, but not in the fantasy section. And I think,
and it could land there easily.
Exactly. I think part of it is, we look to genres to tell us what we can expect, but we don't want to just read the same story over and over again. And I think the fun of working in a genre is that it provides you with this kind of ready-made template, with a set of constraints and limitations. But each one of them can be pushed against. And as a genre, the Western has so much history behind it that anytime you push on a wall, a whole section of the house will come undone. And so it becomes this kind of juggling act of having to keep all these different tropes active and non-ironic, like keeping them serious while also being able to try to push beyond what the Western has traditionally been.
I think there's a lot of people in this country who would wrongly say this, but they think that they have a great American novel stuck inside of them. You clearly do. I mean, it says right here,
Thank you.
A superb novel that declares the arrival of an astonishing new voice, which is a pretty nice thing to put on the cover.
It's high praise, certainly.
But were there ever times where you were writing this and thinking, geez, I don't know, maybe, or did it just kind of flow? Can you talk to us about the whole process?
Yeah, I say this quite often. I actually once mentioned this and I got some pushback from the audience member who asked the question. But I like to say I find writing to be excruciating, just one of the worst things that I do on a regular basis voluntarily. I said that once, and the person who asked the question was like, well, and it's rewarding, right? And I almost had forgotten that it was something that could be rewarding, because I find it to be so mentally draining to write anything. And so, at every single moment while I was writing it, it felt like maybe it wasn't something that I could pull off. And it did feel like a miracle that it got done at all. And now, staring down the barrel of trying to write a second book, I have much the same feeling. And from what I've heard, it never gets any easier.
1, 2, 3, one more.
Since the pandemic, anti-Asian violence has increased, with 1 in 6 Asian American adults reportedly experiencing a hate crime in 2021. That's according to a national survey by AAPI Data and Momentive. Another disturbing survey result found that 1 in 5 Americans believe Asian Americans are at least partly responsible for COVID-19. That's from the 2022 Status Index, which assesses attitudes and stereotypes about Asian Americans.
We did talk a little bit about the brutal quality of living in the United States as somebody who moved here from China and working on the railroad. Bookend that with the current situation, which we've seen a lot of anti-Asian hate here in this country, and I've interviewed some folks recently who've been pretty outspoken about it, that the country still, this many years later, there's still kind of that threat of racism, and I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think if I have learned anything through my research, it's that the structures of oppression in this country and racism are old structures, that they have deep roots. And so I think it's a little bit misleading to say, there's been a recent uptick in anti-Asian American violence, as though it came from nothing. I think as soon, and you can find evidence for this as well, as soon as Asian Americans began to appear in America, they begin to be cast as the other. And the function of identifying a group that is specifically not what we are is it stabilizes our own identity. And so the Asian as the other helps to stabilize the American white identity as long as they're there. And so this kind of contrast, they have all these ads, these anti-Chinese labor ads in the 1870s and 80s that kind of depict two poles, right? We can have American meat or Chinese rice. And really that's shorthand for, we have these two almost diametrically opposed worldviews. And so in order to stabilize our own, we have to point to and locate the other. And, in the case of anti-Asian racism, it was Asian Americans. But because of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, there was this almost 100-year gap between these two populations of Asian American immigrants to the United States. So I'm in that latter half because I came over with my family in 2000. But there's this kind of massive gulf between Asian Americans who have been here for 150 years and who have been here for 30 or 40. And the things that I have in common with those laborers are quite few. They're from a different region of China. They spoke a different dialect. And yet we're kind of connected by this accident of history and choice, which is that we were both Asian in America. And that has remained quite constant throughout the history, for better and for worse.
And you talked about how deep the roots are of racism in this country, which means, like if we're thinking of it as a tree or a plant, in order for those roots to grow, they have to be nurtured and watered and cultivated. So how do we uproot that? Do you think about that, and how do you change that kind of culture in this country?
Yeah, I think one of the ways that we reproduce the systems of oppression that we inherit is we recreate them in the media and the stories we tell. And I think to a large extent, for much of its history, the Western as a genre was that tool of narrative. It not only accounted for this kind of pivotal moment in American history where we become a bicoastal nation, but it also offers this kind of normative aspect where it says not only is this how we got where we are, but this is why we ought to have done that, have done so. And so it becomes kind of post facto justification for indigenous genocide and kind of pushing all these people out of their ancestral homelands for this kind of massive surge of violence and racism. And it is the story of American myth-making itself. And the fact that it's been so readily exported, we have the spaghetti westerns, we have Kurosawa's samurai films, which are inspired by westerns. It speaks to this kind of fact that like the story of totally extreme suffering in a wild and frontier land, at the boundary, I think is a really captivating story that just happened to be used in American history for this kind of imperialist purpose.
You mentioned spaghetti westerns. Clint Eastwood, if they make this into a movie, is not going to play the title character. How important was it to kind of change that narrative? And how does that move the ball, not just from you as a writer and getting your work out there, but also kind of what you were talking about, kind of changing the narrative, seeing a story with a different kind of character in it versus the way we've always seen it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I had the idea, and I often get asked, where did the idea come from? And I like to say, if I knew where ideas come from, I would be there all the time. You would never see me. I'd just be getting new ideas from the idea fountain. But alas, I think it's a little more complicated than that. So I first had the idea of a Western with a Chinese American protagonist. That was it. And I figured I can't be the first person to have this idea, and I wasn't. But there were so few of those stories, and I began to realize that Westerns have gone more readily into space, for space operas, than they have stayed right here and featured people who were actually there, among them Chinese laborers, and. So I tried, I wanted to do more research. I knew nothing about that time. And so as I did more research, the story kind of fell into place. But I think it's absolutely crucial to have stories that feature a diverse cast of characters and a diversity of viewpoints and ethnicities, because when I was a kid writing stories, I wanted to be a writer from a very young age. And I would write these stories, and I was looking back through some of this, my earlier work, and this is like, when I was 7 or 8. But I was writing these stories that featured white people, and talking to other white people. There were no Asian Americans, there were no black people in my stories, and I went to public school in New York City. I had mostly friends of color, and yet I was writing these stories about white people because I had learned through the books that I was reading that that's what stories were about. That's what books, real serious books were about, is white people and their interactions with other white people and kind of extremely high level problems like a slow divorce or a creeping illness. And I think it was a revelation to me when I wrote my first stories with Asian American characters in them. So I was suddenly able to access a whole, an entire part of my identity that I had kind of suppressed out of worry and anxiety, and I think that was a really pivotal moment. And I think if I had read stories as a kid with Asian American leads, I think I would have been much happier with who I was.
Tom Lin, what a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.